Good morning and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Bill Benson. I am the host of the museum's public program, First Person. Thank you for joining us today. We are in our 17th year of the First Person program, and our first person today is Mrs. Jill Pauly, whom we shall meet shortly. This 2016 season of First Person is made possible by the generosity of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation with additional funding from the Arlene and Daniel Fisher Foundation. We are grateful for their sponsorship, and I'm pleased to let you know that Mr. Lewis Smith is here with us today. First Person is a series of conversations with survivors of the Holocaust who share with us their firsthand accounts of their experience during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as volunteers here at this museum. Our program will continue twice weekly through mid-August. The museum's website at www.ushmm.org provides information about each of our upcoming first-person guests. The address is also in your program that you received today. Anyone interested in keeping in touch with the museum and its programs can complete the Stay Connected card that you will find in your program or speak with a museum representative at the back of the theater. In doing so, you will receive an electronic copy of Jill Pauly's biography so that you can remember and share her testimony after you leave here today. Jill will share with us her first-person account of her experience during the Holocaust and as a survivor for about 45 minutes. If we have time toward the end of our program, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask Jill a few questions. The life stories of Holocaust survivors transcend the decades. What you are about to hear from Jill is one individual's account of the Holocaust. We've prepared a brief slide presentation to help with her introduction. Jill Pauly was born Gisela Renata Berg on May 1st, 1933 in Cologne, Germany. The arrow on this map points to the city of Cologne. Jill and her family lived in Leschenesch, a small town outside of Cologne. In this photo, Jill, who is on the right, and her older sister Inga picnic in the Eifel Mountains in 1937 with their mother Clara and their aunt and uncle. The Nazis came to power shortly before Jill was born in 1933. On November 9th through 10th, 1938, the Nazis carried out a nationwide pogrom against Germany's Jews known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. This is an historical photo of Germans passing by a vandalized store of a Jewish shopkeeper. Alerted to the danger, Jill and her family fled to Cologne. Jill's family decided to emigrate from Germany, and in May 1939, they left for Kenya. In this photo, we see Jill, who is on the right, and Inga, while on the German ship that took them on a 2-week journey from Genoa, Italy, to Mombasa, Kenya. Jill and her family lived in Kenya for the next 7 years. Pictured here is a group portrait of Jill's extended family on their farm in Kenya. Jill is in the middle, and she's surrounded by her mother and father in the upper right-hand corner, her grandparents to either side of her, her uncle, and her sister Inga, who's just behind Jill. Jill and her husband Kurt, who's also a Holocaust survivor, have lived in the Washington, D.C. area since 1974, but will soon be moving to Long Island to be closer to their children. I'm pleased to let you know that Kurt will be joining us this morning here with Jill. Jill and Kurt have 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and have added just another great-grandchild for a total of 2 great-grandchildren. Jill enjoyed a very successful career in real estate. She volunteers at the museum's donors desk, where you will find her Monday mornings, where Jill says she meets, quote, such lovely people, which makes it so rewarding, end quote. And with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our first person, Mrs. Jill Pauly. Jill, thank you so much for joining us and for being willing to be our first person today. We have just an hour, and you have a great deal to share with us, so we're gonna start right away.
Okay.
You told me, Jill, that Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, was the catalyst for the directions and decisions that your family's life took for the balance of the Holocaust and the war. You were very young at that time, just 5 years of age. Let's begin with you telling us about your family and the events in your family's life leading up to Kristallnacht and that catalytic event for you and your family.
Actually, I was thinking about it this morning or last night, about the generations of my family going back in the area near Cologne, 1 hour by car from Holland. And I personally have genealogy that go back to the early 1700s in that area.
Some 300 years worth of family.
Yes, and my father's mother, my grandmother, who lived with us until she passed away, we lived together, told the family that she believed her ancestors escaped the Inquisition in Spain. And the family moved, we don't know where to, but landed up in a city called Krefeld, which is only about also 45 minutes from Holland. Now, they might not have settled in Krefeld right away. I have a feeling that a lot of the Jews that came up through Spain and upward went to the Netherlands.
Okay.
And then wandered over. That's one side. The other side, I don't know. Been there forever.
Tell us about your parents. Your father, what was your father's occupation?
My father was a cattle dealer.
Okay.
Going back to the 1600s, there were two professions that the churches permitted the Jews to go into. One was horse trading, the other was cattle dealing. And they were, these people were small farmers, land keepers, Orthodox Jews in my case. And they had small businesses. I read some stuff on it, they had to go to court because somebody did something to their cow. I mean, it was a little tiny business. And by the time my late father was married, they had a big cattle business. There were 4 partners in it, family. They had land, they had houses, they had money. They did well. And my father really was a very creative person and superbly talented with animals. So much so when he came to the United States and settled in New Jersey, what do you call a doctor? The veterinarian. The veterinarian in the area would pick him up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, which disturbed everybody. Where did you go at 4 or 5 in the morning? And he'd come back and he'd say, well, he had a very serious case, and I tried to help him save the animal.
So he knew his business.
He knew his business.
Jill, Hitler came to power, the Nazis came to power in 1933, 5 years before Kristallnacht. Right away, restrictions on Jews began. And one of the things you had told me that keeping kosher was forbidden by the Nazis, and yet at considerable risk, your family continued to do so. Tell us how they managed that.
It was a form of resistance. They were very courageous. They decided they had been forbidden slaughtering, they had been forbidden to do business in 1937. They were hemmed in, and there were families in the area, thank God, where we lived, that were very anti-Nazi, that eventually helped them a lot. But they went on their own with this kosher slaughtering. It just wouldn't give it up. I don't know, I guess 99% of the people did, but they were the 1% that wouldn't. And they took risks. And they were raided. Our house was raided. I don't remember that. I must have been there. And my uncle had hiding places for these special knives. And he strapped them to the inside of the chimney. They didn't get them. And they continued doing it. I had one uncle, I went back in 2012, and I went to his house where they lived. And I tried to see if my memory, nothing kicked in, but I saw a retaining wall, one side of the yard, that had hooks built into it. And I asked the woman who took me there, I said, what are those for, those round things? She said, they used to tie up the cattle there.
Still in the wall there.
He had an abattoir. He was a kosher slaughterer. He was the one in the family that produced and sold the meat. And he decided to continue doing it. And what he did, and he had a Nazi right next door who watched every step they took. He did the kosher killing. He had a man help him that he trusted, and then he took a gun and shot into the severed head, so the neighbor next door would think he shot the animal, and had no way of proving he didn't. I mean, they were really defiant. According to Jewish law, when you're under that kind of pressure, you don't have to keep these laws. But they also didn't know how long it would last, because their non-Jewish friends told them, this is ridiculous, this can't last.
This guy Hitler's not going to last.
No. They thought he was crazy. That was a small percentage of...
Right. Jill, you were 4 years younger than your sister Inga, so at that time you were not yet in school, but Inga was in school. Tell us a little bit from what you know from Inga, what her school experience was like.
It was very sad, really. And this is an example of what Jewish children had to go through. They sent her to, by the way, schooling was compulsory. So they sent her to the community public school. She was 6. And she was beaten by a boy. And she turned around and hit him. And she hit him on the nose, I think. I mean, she just struck out, and he was bleeding. And my parents became very frightened. I took her out of the school. So at the age of 6, she was sent away from home. And this goes for many, many of the German Jewish children. Could not stay at home to go to school because there were no Jewish schools in villages, and they were too young to commute to the big cities. So the children had to be moved. Luckily, there was a schoolhouse where my grandmother lived in another city, another town, and she lived with my grandmother and an aunt. And it was very sad. There was a school teacher there who was really well known. His name was Lehrer Gottlieb. He had from 1st grade to 8th grade in one room, and he taught Hebrew reading. It was a Jewish, and at the same time they also had secular studies. He was outstanding. I mean, what my sister had by the age of 9 was unbelievable. And I've read his history, his story. He would not leave town where he was. He said he had never done anything to anyone. He wasn't political. He wasn't into anything detrimental. And nobody had any issues with him, so he felt people wouldn't do anything to him. They picked him up. They sent him to the camps. I can't remember which one, but he was murdered in a camp. He was really a very innocent man.
Jill, of course, 5 years after Hitler came to power, the night of November 9th through 10th, 1938, is what we call Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Tell us what you recall and what you know about the events of that terrible night and what happened that night for your family.
Kristallnacht happened in the morning, November 9th, 1939. I was 5 and a half. for some reason, my grandparents and I were sitting in the living room where we never sat often. We usually were in the kitchen, but we were in the living room because there was a little stove in there. I think it was cold that November 9th. And there was a knock on the door at 9 o'clock in the morning by a righteous Gentile, a friend. Told my father not to go near the synagogue that day. My father was dressed to go. I remember he was wearing a white shirt. It was 9 o'clock. My father said, why? He says, don't ask me why. Just, if I tell you not to go, don't go. He says, but I don't know what you're talking about. What's happening? The guy said, it's something bad. And he left. Well, that really, they hadn't heard. Until then, the phones hadn't rung. They hadn't heard anything. It was not in the newspaper. It wasn't announced, of course. And they started screaming. They were so terrified. They didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do. And I guess there were a lot of recriminations about not having left when they should have left. And my grandmother had a broken leg. Her leg was in a cast. She was a very heavy woman. She jumped out of that chair and she said, call a driver, we're leaving. We're leaving. You know, leaving where? Doing what? Where are you going? She decided to get the driver, who was a non-Jewish man, a friend, but he did it for money. It was his business. And he took my sister and I and the grandparents. And God, when we came out...
Separately from your parents?
Separately. They removed us from the parents. And when we came out the front door, my sister started to scream. And when I saw her so terrorized, I suppose I started screaming too. And what was going on is we were smelling smoke. We were seeing flakes fly through the air, and it was gray. And it was the synagogue burning. It was just a block and a half up the street. And they stuffed us in the car, and my grandmother said, get down on the floor, put your face down. We did. And she put her feet on one of us, and my grandfather put his feet on the other one. And it really helped. It quietened us down. And we were not allowed to get up until we were close to Cologne. And then she let us look out the window, and I remember seeing fires. And somehow it was dusky. I remember seeing the Nazi flags for the first time. They really kept me under wraps. I mean, I wasn't out of the house without an adult, ever. I couldn't play in our own backyard because my mother was afraid of being overlooked by neighbors' teenage children who might be in the Nazi party. So, to me, this was like, they were beautiful, those flags. The colors were pretty. And the guy drove us to a street, and we got out, and we went into an apartment where 4 uncles and aunts lived together in retirement. It was a 2-bedroom apartment. I don't even remember that. I spoke to my sister last night. She said, you know, that was a 2-bedroom apartment, and we were 12 people in there. And what I do remember very much is the instructions the adults gave us. And that frightened me to the point, I guess, of depression. Mm-hmm. I was unhappy in that apartment with all these adults, some of them older, no children I never had children to play with. It was just awful. And I reacted very badly. I had a personality change overnight. At home in the country where we in the house where we lived, my grandmother was very good at keeping me occupied. But once I was in that apartment, she wasn't there, and my grandfather wasn't there. And my mother was harassed. I mean, she had a sick mother in the apartment who was dying of cancer. Nobody had room for anything. There were no beds for us. We didn't sleep in a bed, my sister and I, for 18 months until we were settled. And
Was your father there in the house with you?
no.
Tell us about your father.
No. The men ran away. They took two family cars and they kept driving.
Because the Jewish men were being rounded up.
Yes.
Right. 30,000 in total, I believe. Yeah.
Yes, but they didn't know that then. Mm-hmm. They just knew they were going to be picked up. Mm-hmm. So they got in cars and they drove. And they eventually landed up in the woods overnight. And they heard the next morning that it was called off. That doesn't mean they weren't picking up people up anymore, but the looting and the beating and the destruction was called off. And I have to tell you, 40 years later, what happened. I went back to Germany the first time in 1982. And a woman came to visit me. She wanted to meet me. I never met her before. I didn't know who she was. And she asked me, she said, I have a particular question. What was your father and his brothers doing at the gas station in Leschenich on Kristallnacht?
40 years later, she asked you this question.
1982. So I said, well, I would presume they were getting gasoline. Well, I said, why are you asking me? She said, because I was there. I saw them. Luck. Mm-hmm. She was 10 years old. It would have been very easy for this little girl to report that the Jews were at the gas station just now. Mm-hmm. I came back to New York, to the States, and I asked my mother about this because I was curious. And she said, yes, that was a gas station that was willing to sell gas to the Jews and not report them. So it was luck. Mm-hmm. Kristallnacht was on a Thursday. On a Friday afternoon, the men came into Cologne for the Sabbath. And on Sunday morning, my father, no, it must have been immediate because they left. On Saturday night, we went upstairs into the building where the apartment was, where we were gathered. My father was going to go into hiding with us in the attic, like Otto Frank did with his family. And thank God, Inga screamed at night. She had nightmares. So he knew he couldn't stay there. So on Sunday, they all got in a car, the three men, and drove into Holland without permission. They were caught. They were put in prison. And that's a whole different part of the story, the Dutch part.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you continue with that part of it?
Okay. My parents were very connected in Holland because it was an hour away by car. My father did a lot of business there, and my uncles. And two of my uncles and an aunt left Germany in 1937 to go to Holland because they couldn't make a living in Germany any longer. The uncles used to work for our company, the two uncles, and the company was closed down by the Nazis. In 1937, they got a little postcard from the government that they were no longer allowed to do business. So my family was not functioning, and the business wasn't functioning, so this family had to go to Holland. And when they got to Holland, they weren't allowed to work because they came in And Holland had already been occupied by maybe 30,000 German Jews, and the Dutch were having economic problems, so they forbid them to work. If they had money to live on, fine. If they didn't, that was tough. But they were connected there. And through the connection in Holland, one of my uncles was a partisan in Holland, one of these. He used to take newspapers to the river, to the water, whatever water there was, I don't know. And he used to sit there and read newspapers. And Jews swam over from Germany.
Across the border into Holland.
They swam. And he had coats with him and newspapers and handed them coats and newspapers. And they disappeared into Holland. He was gutsy. He was in his 20s. He was fluent in Dutch. He was born on the Dutch border. He came to see the men in the prison.
Where your father was.
Where the men were, where the three men, my father and my two uncles. And he said to the prison guard, "What are you going to do with these people?" He said, "I'm sending them back to Germany tomorrow morning." He was a Nazi. And my uncle said, "You can't do that. It's against the law. You have to have written permission from The Hague." He had called an attorney before. And you can't send them back without that written permission. So the guy said, "You bet I will if I don't have that piece of paper." He got him that piece of paper. And believe it or not, they were connected to a man who was the court Jew to the Queen.
To the Queen of the Netherlands?
The Queen of the Netherlands wrote a permission for these three men to stay interned in Holland in a camp until they could leave. She saved their lives. They were in an internment camp for 9 months. Wasn't a concentration camp, but they suffered terribly from being cut off from everybody. They couldn't communicate. My uncle told me that my father was desperate in that camp. Everything he had in his life was in Germany.
Right.
And
including the rest of his family.
Right.
Yeah. So Jill, here's your father and your two uncles interned in Holland. They can't get out of there. And now the rest of the family really springs into action. Your family makes a decision that we must leave Germany. And you were able to accomplish that by June, I believe it was, of 1939.
Yeah.
About 7 months after Kristallnacht. Tell us how that came about, what the family went through in order for you to leave Germany, knowing that they felt they had to get out of there.
they knew that before. I think it was on the table from 1935. But my father was the kind of man who didn't want to go to a country where he couldn't make a living. He had 7 people to support. And my mother said he spent the whole year of 1937 looking for a way out. He couldn't work at home. By the way, I really need to bring this up. A postcard telling people, as of this day, you may not continue making a living. So that had to be obeyed.
Your career, your livelihood is over.
Right.
That postcard.
1 month later, I saw the postcard. I don't know what happened to it. I have it in my paper somewhere. 1st of January, 1938, telling my father and the business and the families that everything they own now belongs to the state. So making a decision to leave the country was not that difficult. The difficulty was there were no countries letting people in. Half of the Jews of Germany left before Kristallnacht, but most of them went to surrounding countries, and they were caught up in the war and killed. So it was impossible. It was possible to get out. We just couldn't get in anywhere. A woman that married into the family came from a very educated family. She had a cousin who saw Hitler speak on the street in Munich in the 1920s. And he had made a decision that as soon as he got finished with his university, he was leaving. And he went to England. And he and his partner started a chemical factory. This man had a sideline. He helped Jews get out of Germany into somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And
From his place in England.
from his place in
Okay.
England. He had brought over his brother out of Germany, put him through law school. This brother got a job with a company in Nairobi, Kenya, a law firm. So in 1937, his brother went to Nairobi. 3 or 4 years ago, we got letters that passed between the families. And this man, his name was Herman Strauss, was in this company in Nairobi where there was a man who had very good relations with the British government. I believe he was Jewish. And through that connection and the monies that my grandmother sent out of the country the day I was born, she sent the business money into Holland. She wouldn't allow it to stay in Germany in any bank. So with that money, he was able to facilitate our getting out.
So he was able to purchase affidavits or visas that allowed you to travel to Kenya?
They allowed us to come in. When they found out that the family had money, they became very interested, according to the letters. And they didn't quite know how to get a hold of that money. So they charged a lot of money per head, per person to come in.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, I saw the lists 3-4 years ago of the people who applied. Her side of the family, the parents, applied, and they were rejected. And many years later, her family, members of her family that survived, disowned her because she saved our side of her husband's side, but she did not save her side. And we never knew why. Well, her son found out by chance, by calling England 3-4 years ago. She spoke to the daughter of the man who saved us. She said the reason she could not bring her parents out was because the sister was an epileptic, and they would not accept the sister. So the parents decided to stay with the sister. This woman suffered. She saved 19 people. And she suffered for the rest of her life. She was on drugs to keep her going. She was so depressed. And she never knew that this happened because of her sister's illness.
But she was able to get your family along with your relative in England.
We got into Kenya, not in June, like July. Beginning of July 1939. My father and the 3 men who were imprisoned in Holland were already in Kenya. They had gotten us places to stay. It was terribly difficult on my mother.
So how many of you total left Germany?
Germany, 12 of us got
12
on
of
the
you left.
train.
Mm-hmm.
In Holland, they came later. The 3 men that were interned left
there
first.
before you. Mm-hmm.
Then we left, and then the others that had, there were a family of 4 in Holland that went on the boat the day when Hitler walked in.
Into Holland? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So your mother, particularly, and grandparents, which were, I think, crucial to making the decisions, they made all the arrangements in Germany, working with folks in England. Were able to pack up a lot of stuff to move, which, of course, never made it, right?
Right. They had money in the bank. Really quite funny. And the women went out and decided to buy. They were going to Africa in 1939. They didn't really know where they were going and what this was like or where they would be living. So they bought all sorts of things. All the money that was left in the banks, they gave some to the relatives that needed it, and the rest they went out shopping. And each family had a lift. A lift is like a 9 by 10 room, full of stuff.
Full of stuff to go to Kenya.
Mm-hmm. And those lifts were sent to Hamburg, to the port. Mm-hmm. And I think there were 7 lifts. I mean, 3 or 4 arrived. Rest didn't.
Mm-hmm. And if I remember from something you told me, that you were at that time, you were allowed to leave and take goods with you, but you had to pay 100% tax on anything you took out of the country.
And you had to pay double the tax.
Pay double the tax.
Double, on everything.
On everything to get out.
On tickets, on anything that you took out of the country. For Jews, it was double.
And yet the majority of it did not make it.
Right,
one of the ironies to me that you shared with me is when you finally were able to leave Germany, you made your way to Italy, to Genoa, where you boarded a ship, and you boarded a German ship. A German ship was taking you to Kenya.
First, the trip from Cologne to Genoa was so dangerous. And the danger was that we would get separated. A big thing for the Germans was separating families. And they did it well. So my mother sat us down, as little as we were. I was 6. And she said she got across that this was not for children, this was an adult thing. We were not to move on that train. We were not to ask for food, not to go to the bathroom. Nothing. We were to sit still from Cologne until we were out of the country. And again, I wanted to know why. And I then started to understand that we could be separated. And that I was terrified. So I was very good. We didn't move. And my very sick grandmother was in the compartment with us. When we went over the border from Germany into Switzerland, I can promise you, I had never, ever seen my mother smile from the day I was born. Mm-hmm. Her face was in a constant state of pain until we crossed that line out of Germany.
Into Switzerland, a neutral country. Yeah.
Of course, she knew when we got to Genoa, we were getting back on a German ship, which was a Nazi ship. And she had the 2 children and my grandparents, and they were old. And we got on that ship, and she hears that all the Jews will be on the lower deck and the rest of humanity on the upper decks. And she really got furious. She was so angry. But she had to put up with it. Mm-hmm. And we were on the ship, and to me it was heaven. You know why? I was sun deprived. I needed the energy of the sun. I was a child that was inside all the time.
You'd been so completely protected over those previous
And when
months.
I was happy, I sang.
Yep.
I was singing.
And there's a story there. You have to share that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was off by myself singing. I don't know what I played with, maybe a doll. And I was overheard, and by the Nazi captain, I don't know who, and he called my mother up, said he wanted to know if she would give permission for me to sing for the crew on the ship. What was she going to say? There were problems. I had learned the whole Passover history, the Haggadah, which we read and sing once a year at the Seder, because my uncles in Cologne, my great uncles, had gorgeous voices. One of them was an opera singer. And to keep me busy, they taught me the whole Haggadah and music. And I sang German folk songs. Who knows what I was singing? I don't know. And the women got so frightened because they didn't want me to sing Hebrew songs.
To the Nazi captain and his crew. Right?
Yeah, when I was 6 years old, And they had me up in the cabin, my two grandmothers and a couple of the aunts, singing with me what I should sing and what I shouldn't sing. I guess I made it. Mm-hmm. I thought I did it once. But a lady that's still living, who's 98, always told me, no, you did it every day for 2 weeks. Mm. Made them happy, I guess. It was fine. And they left us alone. They really didn't bother us on the ship. But for my mother, it was a terrible stress because she didn't know that the ship was going to take us to Kenya. What did they know? When we got to the harbor in Mombasa, there was a man in European clothes and a European hat, and that was my father.
Waiting for you at Mombasa.
Mm-hmm. And we had a little experience with my mother. He had rented a room somewhere, I don't know what it was, a hotel, I don't know, for us to stay the first night and then continue traveling by train. And I was sleeping on something called a camp bed at the foot of the bed, and I hear screaming. It was dark out. My mother was screaming, and we didn't know why. And there was a black man in a long white gown and a hat, fez hat, serving tea before daybreak. And he frightened my mother. And she made it a condition with I remember her saying, as long as I'm in this country, I don't want to be woken up at 6 a.m. for tea.
Before you left the ship,
Cultural
I think that,
yeah.
if I remember correctly, one of your grandfathers or one of your grandparents would not leave the ship for a while because it was the Shabbat, wasn't it?
No.
No?
No, he wouldn't go to Kenya.
He wouldn't go to Kenya.
Unless he knew there was kosher food on the ship.
And he was able to get it, right?
The women called Berlin. There was some kind of organization that brought the food to the ship. And according to Jewish law, he didn't have to do that either. I mean, they didn't know what lay ahead. They could have done anything. They just didn't know. Nobody knew what the final solution would be.
When you arrived in Kenya, I believe it was July 1939, of course, the war began just a couple of months later. Mm-hmm. In fact, just over a month later, mm-hmm. September 1st, when Germany and Russia invaded Poland, was the start of World War II. By that time, you're in Kenya. So now you're in a completely different world. What was that like for the family?
Difficult. Mm-hmm. Difficult in a different way. The persecution continued. For my sister and I, we were under persecution for 12 years. So the family was under persecution for 12 years. In Kenya, there were laws pertaining to Germans, of course, but German Jews. We were German Jews. We always felt, well, they didn't understand. Why were they doing this? We came there to be liberated from fear. And the reason they didn't understand it is because we didn't know that there were Nazis stealing Jewish identities and sneaking into Allied countries. So they had no way of knowing who was who. So when the war broke out, they came around and they picked up all the men in the family and put them in camps. And we were left. Just my grandmother told them if they took the grandfather, she would have to come along. Mm-hmm. So they didn't
so they
take
left
him.
The grandfather?
They left him.
So in the eyes of the British, mm-hmm. because you were first and foremost in their eyes, you were German. Therefore, you were considered enemy aliens.
We were enemy aliens.
You were enemy aliens,
yes.
even though you had escaped there to get away from
right.
the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And we remained enemy aliens until the end of the war.
The end of the war.
So that when the family had enough money left for a down payment on a farm, nothing else. I mean, they couldn't go for haircuts after that. Nothing. All the money they had was spent on saving us. Mm-hmm. There we were on a farm. They locked us up. We were interned on the farm. Could not leave without permission. Whenever they left the farm, they had to send a black man on a bicycle to a place called Kiambu, that's where the commissioner was, and he had to sign a statement that they could leave the farm to go shopping. They didn't go every week. They went every 2-3 weeks to Nairobi to shop. Now, I don't know if my sister and I needed anything, because we had to go to school. They didn't interfere in that.
And you had to go to English school.
British schools. We went to British boarding schools. We did not board in the schools because my mother wouldn't let us go where there was no kosher food. So we lived with families that were close to the schools. There were very difficult schools, very, very difficult schools. They were feeder schools to Oxford and Cambridge. The British education was tough. And the teachers were mean, very mean. And I learned later that those teachers were placed there against their will. They really didn't do this voluntarily. They were placed there by the government, and they didn't like it. So they had to let it out somewhere. What? You have a little Jewish girl, you can pick on her anytime.
I was struck when you told me that, almost right away, there you are in English-speaking school. Of course, you don't speak English, and they're demanding that you sing God Save the King, mm-hmm. And that you learn Wordsworth's The Daffodils, and you had to recite that. And so your education had to come very quickly. Very quickly,
very quickly. We lived in a big house in Nairobi for 6 weeks, and my father put us into school the first day we got there. And the tradition was that the black young men would carry our lunch boxes and walk us to school. Now, this is with a mother coming out of Nazi Germany. Okay, we had to go to school. So these two young men took us. It was about a 25-minute walk through the woods over a water, where you had to take your shoes and socks off to cross over to school. And we didn't know any language. We didn't know Swahili, we didn't know English. They certainly didn't know German. Within 6 weeks, we understood the language. We understood the Swahili, we were speaking with them. English was a little longer, 3 months. Mm-hmm. The teachers were merciless, absolutely merciless.
And during that time, Jill, of course, the British that were there, the men were, of course, going off to fight. They were mm-hmm. joining the army, mm-hmm. having to leave their enterprises, their farms and ranches that they had been running. So that's when they turned to the interned men. Tell us what happened to the men.
The men came out of internment a week after they were put in because we had the farm, because they had put a down payment on the farm. Mm-hmm. Other men couldn't leave until they had jobs. And they placed them far away from Nairobi. We were 20 miles from Nairobi, which wasn't so far. I'm losing my track. Where was I?
Describing that the men now had to manage the English farms.
Yeah. The men, the refugees, were assigned responsibilities to go to British farms and help the women run those farms as their jobs, as their secondary jobs. And my father did that for the duration of the war, and several of the other men did it. And it worked out because these people needed us, and they were close by. That was it.
Jill, you were here with us a couple of years ago with your sister Inga, and I think Inga might have mentioned this, but that you had a clandestine radio at your house. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we had it wasn't clandestine, it was just a radio with, it ran on battery.
Batteries.
And my uncles didn't want those batteries abused because they couldn't get new ones so quickly.
And you would only listen to what was going on in the war at that time.
Yes. And we were really living in the most primitive conditions you can imagine. They found a cinder block house with windows that had frames but no glass. It was just very primitive, but it was cinder block with a tin roof. And they worked on it for about a month with a lot of help, and it was a nice home. We called it home.
I know we're moving forward because of time, Jill, but of course, you would go through one more major upheaval, I think in 1947, just before what is known as the Mau Mau uprisings in Kenya.
No, we left.
And I was going to say you left before that.
Right before.
So what prompted you to leave Kenya and make it, and how did you make it to the United States?
My father was not happy with the political behavior of the British. They were very cruel to the indigenous black people. And my father always taught us, according to the Torah, that was forbidden. You can't do that. And he said, I don't want my daughters growing up in this society. I'm getting out. We're leaving the day the war's over. But we couldn't get out the day the war was over because we didn't have people in the United States who could sponsor us. That took another couple of years. And we left in 47, and in 52 they lost the farm. They still had the farm. Financially, they lost the farm again because of the Mau Mau. And, well, life just went on. You know, you had to work hard and try to make a good beginning in a country. And
so you started all over again here in the
all
United
over
States.
again, third time. And it was difficult.
You were 14 when you arrived.
Right.
What was it like for you? I mean, you now at least spoke English, so you knew the language.
First of all, the first year in school, I loafed. I didn't do anything. And I became salutatorian. I don't know if I opened a book. I went to school, sat on the bench, and went home. I was way ahead. But then things started changing when I went to high
Because of the
school.
English schools, you were way ahead.
Yes.
Okay.
When I went to high school, things got difficult because I had to work. And I had gotten used to not working. And I started making new friends. And it was very, very difficult for me. There's one thing in this world that I was jealous of, nothing else ever, was the comfort level of the kids around me and them growing up together and knowing each other and the way it is in America. It wasn't like that for me. I was removed from family and friends and went to schools with kids who were not particularly my cup of tea. So I had to start from scratch at 14. They had already had it 14 years before me in America, so I had to play catch up. It took me a while, but not too long.
Did your parents make the transition relatively easy, or is that difficult for them?
Very difficult.
Very difficult.
Very difficult. Because of their age. My father was 52. To start over at 52 is very hard.
And he went into the cattle business again, right?
Yes, he did eventually.
Yep.
And made a success of it again. And then he got sick and he sold out the farm. And we loved the United States. I think I did. I didn't like when I arrived. We didn't see the Statue of Liberty, and my father had promised us that. We arrived in Boston.
Jill, just a couple of last questions before we close. And I know we didn't have a chance for you to ask Jill some questions, but when Jill finishes, Jill's going to remain here with us on the stage. And so if anybody would like to come up and ask her a question or just shake her hand or take a photograph, whatever you want to do, please feel free to do that when we close. You mentioned to me that the 4th of July, in the past you've mentioned that the 4th of July has special significance for you. And of course, we've just celebrated the 4th. Why is it so special for you?
Love of country and love of patriotism and respect. I heard a radio program on the 4th of July where a young man who won the Medal of Honor spoke. And he spoke about his background and his life. I believe he was from either Iowa or Idaho. And I remember clearly him saying that he wasn't a very good student in school. But when he was a junior in chemistry class, 9/11 happened. And when they found out, they could, in the beginning, they had a TV in the room, and they saw a plane fly into a building, and they thought it was some nut, who lost his way and flew into the building. But then they very quickly saw that it was two huge planes and that it was terrorism. And he goes home and he tells his mother that he's found his vocation in life. He wants to join the military right away. And she said, no, you have to finish high school, then you can join the military. And he talks about fighting and going into places where you have to shoot back, and how he learned that what he was fighting for was not to go out and kill people. You kill people because they attack you. And he was going out to fight to keep what we have. And I was so impressed and so happy to be living here. It's such a privilege.
It's our tradition that our first person has the last word. So I'm going to turn back to Jill to give us her last word. And when she's finished, our photographer Jill is going to come up on the stage, take a photograph of Jill with you as the backdrop. So I'm going to ask that you all stand at that time. And then, as I mentioned, Jill will stay here on the stage. So please feel free to come up and chat with her if you'd like to. I want to thank all of you for being here. Remind you that we'll have first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. The museum's website provides information about each upcoming first-person guest, and of course we'll have information about our program in 2017. So with that, Jill, close our program.
Okay. I think I just closed the program when I spoke about the young man who won the Medal of Honor, and what a privilege it is to have people like that all over this country, young men who go off to fight in other countries to try and maintain what we have at home. It is so precious. And maybe you have to be a naturalized citizen and go through the hard times of becoming an American. It's not easy. I don't know anybody who just gets off the boat and becomes an American. It's a process, and it's a very, very difficult process. Culturally, financially, socially, it's difficult, and it takes a long time. But it's all worth it. We didn't do a thing or have a thing happen to us that hasn't been rewarding. My husband is here. He was in the forces during the Korean conflict. We adopted children in the United States, which can't happen everywhere. I came to this country, I was 13, not quite 14. Got married at 24. So I was only here 10 years. And within a few years, I adopted American babies. That needed to be provided for. Otherwise, they didn't give you the babies. So I don't think a natural-born American can ever understand what they have here. Most of the people that come here, 99.9%, are running away from something. They're coming to America to live because they want a better life. And they fight for this life to maintain it. So the speech yesterday that I heard really sort of galvanized what I feel. And with that, I thank you for coming and listening.
Thank you, Jill.